Today's webinar will focus on the important relationship that Israel has with three European countries, Ireland, Italy, and Spain. I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and the Emory University emeritus professor of contemporary Middle Eastern history, political science, and Israel studies. Please note that all of our previous webinars are archived on our website, israeled.org, with both audio and visual access. About our Center for Israel Education briefly, we've been writing curriculum, providing sources, and engaging the general public about the politics, culture, and history of Zionism and modern Israel. We've been doing that for 18 years. We are fortunate to have 40,000 weekly viewers to the website. We provide trustworthy content, analyses, documents, sources, maps, and much, much more. Underpinning our work is what we consider to be state-seeking, state-making, and state-keeping, unfolding the quest and perseverance of Jewish self-determination is what we try and convey and have other people understand. And we do it without polemics. We do it with sources and facts. Many of you have shown your support for our work with contributions to sustain our small staff. Visit the website, and if you will, and you want to, go to the donate page. The trigger to the Hamas-Israel war was, of course, the genocidal attack of Hamas terrorists upon Israelis and others on that Saturday morning of October 7th, Simchat Torah, resulting in 1,200 Israelis and others murdered, women raped, babies killed, and more than 240 people killed. Since then, Israel has sought to eliminate the existential threat of Hamas and maneuver between the caring and condemnatory commentaries directed at Israel for engaging in self-defense from a lot of external players, Europeans, the United States, China, the Arab world, and much more. Joining us today will be Noemi Segni, the president of the Union of Italian Jewish Communities, where she leads 21 communities across Italy. She's a native-born Israeli. Rabbi Yoni, who serves as the chief rabbi of Ireland and heads the Dublin Hebrew congregation. And David Hatchwell Altaras, who's the chairman of the Hispanic Jewish Federation in Madrid. These are only three countries where we are taking snapshots today about public and political reactions about Israel and the war. Of course, Europe is a lot more complicated than these three, but we're going to try with these three to start with. A brief background of the European interests in the Middle East. And that impact probably goes back more than 2,000 years. It includes the dispersion of Jews from the Middle East to Europe. Many of them ended up in Italy and in Spain. It includes the Crusader interest in going back to the Middle East in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. It includes the Jewish expulsions from the Iberian Peninsula in the 1400s, and in the aftermath of World War I, the evolution of states and regions emerging after Britain and France had an impact on the geographic borders. It includes the impact of the Holocaust, the Cold War, the interest in Middle Eastern oil. At the outbreak of this war on October 7th, European countries aligned with Israel in its fight against Hamas, at least verbally. 50 years earlier, however, European countries would not allow the U.S. to resupply Israel with arms and munitions during the 73 war. So to say that it's an up and down relationship, historically, I think is entirely correct. So let's get specific about Spain, Italy, and Ireland. David, as the chairman and co-founder of the Hispanic Jewish Federation, which connects the Spanish-speaking and Jewish worlds, can you provide us, please, with some context of the Jewish community status today, as it was before October 7?
Well, first of all, I must touch the first issue that you've spoken about, which is the complex history that Jews have in the Iberian Peninsula. We're talking about a relationship that has practically 3,000 years of history. People think about 2,000, but there were Jews already in the Iberian Peninsula in the times of King Shlomo. And also, we can recall in the Haftarah of Yoni, the famous travel from the port city of Yafo to Tarshish. So the commercial routes were already established. We have to go straight into the point and talk about the relationship that hasn't been easy all the time. There's light and darkness. There are glorious times of Judaism here. There's glorious times of tolerance also in the Iberian Peninsula. But basically, 1492 represented the end of a period that had started a century before that with pogroms and conversion attempts. Now, what is very interesting is that Jews in 1492 represented 8% of the overall population of Spaniards, of the recently established Spanish identity. That's how it was done, through Christianity and conquering of the whole Iberian Peninsula. And that 8%, half of the Jews left, and these are the Sephardics of today, and the other half converted to Christianity. Now, in the law of exponential growth, if you take that percentage of the population and you keep on making intermarriages over 25 iterations, which is these 500 years, it is impossible to find anyone in Spain that doesn't have Jewish DNA. And this is a very interesting phenomenon because it doesn't happen anywhere else in Europe. Now, having said that, most Spaniards are not conscious about that reality. Our task is to make sure that they understand not only that they have Jewish DNA to start with, doesn't matter if it's a 2%, 15%, or what have you, but they also share values. Spaniards don't understand that their Christian values originate as Judeo-Christian values, and this is an important phenomenon to mark. The Jewish communities were reestablished in the beginning of the 1900s, the one in Barcelona in 1915, in Madrid in 1917. So they're pretty young. Those communities are small still, and they haven't really gotten out of the dhimmi mentality, I would say, because they were born mainly out of Ashkenazim who founded them, but then the main communities were established by Northern African Jews that came into Spain and then Latin Americans. 1986 marked the year of the establishment of diplomatic relationships between Spain and Israel, which shows you already that it took Spain 7 years after Egypt to establish the relationship. So that in itself also tells you a little bit the attitude that Spain had to go slowly about a process of recognition, not only between the two states, but also a rekindling of the relationship between two people. And we are right now probably at our lowest point since 1492. We have a terrible government leading this country in general. And this government that has gone radical in terms of the left, the coalition also with the Catalan independentists, with the heirs of the Basque separatist terrorism, have established an alliance which is very anti-Israel at its core, and that is using any type of smokescreen in order not to talk about domestic problems, domestic lack of legitimacy by the prime minister. And this is why they're agitating the Palestinian issue, to say it in a way, so that it becomes something that takes away attention from the real problems of Spain. Spain has become de facto the most anti-Israel Western country. And I don't want to take any protagonism from our friends in Ireland or in Norway or in Slovenia, but frankly speaking, we have the deputy prime minister talking about Israel as a genocidal state. We have various calls to boycott also from various ministers of the government. And we have also a government that is actively supporting the International Court of Justice's pantomime of South Africa, and this is something that is being done. And as I said, this is all part of a plan. We have to remember that the radical left in Spain, its main party, Podemos, was financed by Iran. This is something that is known today by the state attorney's office. This is a fact. And when you confront these radical leftists about it, they say that it is normal that in politics you have to ride with certain incongruences in order to arrive to power. So yes, we do have a very serious problem. This problem is very circumscribed to a certain sector of society. Unfortunately, it's on the left, on the radical left. Today, they govern the country nationally. But if you look at the rest of how the country is established, you have 17 regions, 14 out of them are in the center right, which is more pro-Israel. So there is hope for the near future.
How many Jews in Spain today?
About 25,000 Jews overall. Nobody knows the real statistic. I used to be president of the Jewish community of Madrid for a long while, and nobody has the specific statistics because there's no list of Jews. This is a very problematic issue in Europe. And today, there are more Jews that are Spanish in terms of passports because in 2015, we were able to pass this law that conveys the Spanish nationality to the descendants of the Sfaradim. So many Jews from all over the world who could claim for that became Spaniards. So the number has grown. But I would tell you that living in Spain, there's about 25,000 Jews.
Naomi, welcome to our webinar. Thank you for all you do for the Italian Jewish community. If you, like David, could provide some context of before October 7 and what was the sense and what were the realities, where have we traveled in these last 9 months?
First of all, we are 21 communities representing 25,000 Jews all over Italy. And the union is the only body that, by virtue of law, represents the Jewish issues in Italy. So defending Jewish interests, situations, developing culture, schools, rabbis, everything that has to do with Jewish life, Jewish heritage, which is, you can understand, a huge amount of activities. So it's important to understand that in Italy, we have one formal entity that is recognized by the law as the representative organization, and it's not congregations that are made up of people who decide to participate in that association, congregation, or lobby organization. So the government in Italy has always had the union as its main reference for Jewish issues until October 7th, and maybe until the elections in 2022. The challenge for Jewish people, the main challenge or the main message of focus was, of course, on the memory of the Holocaust and the Shoah, and making sure that the country understands its fascist past and what fascists have done to Italy, and not only to Jewish people, by dragging the country to a war. And of course, we know very well the consequences. And this was the challenge, and saying Jewish people is not only the Shoah, is not Holocaust, and there is a responsibility of the fascism. That was, let's say, the political challenge, and we had relationship with all the parties in the parliament. Now, after the elections with the government of Meloni, we found ourselves in a situation where the government represents a more center-right position. I wouldn't define it as a radical extremism at a right situation, but it's more center-right, very, very relevant, of course, but we are managing any kind of situation with it. So we find that from the beginning, the government and different ministers, which are the most relevant for us, which is justice, culture, internal affairs, police, education, universities, all these ministers are extremely positive in the relation and projects and defending Israel. And this has been kept as a situation also after October 7th, which is really amazing. They are truly convinced about the reasons of Israel. But there is, of course, a but. On the opposite, we have left parties which are completely on the wave of populistic sayings, and of course, giving support to all kinds of manifestations, demonstrations, a situation in universities, and so on. So this support that we see in the government as a very friendly government, in spite of some situations that are difficult to be really supportive of, which regard the composition of the government of Netanyahu, which is a delicate issue, they are very, very supportive. But this, on the opposite, we have a wide range of civil institutions, situations, and media, which are completely against. So we have a dual situation of a very strong government pronunciations in favor of Israel, and very strong situations which are all over, from all kinds of situations, universities and schools, then the street demonstrations against Israel. And of course, by saying against Israel, translated means against the Jewish communities. So every day we have an issue, we have initiatives that we try, of course, to defend. On the two-state solution, which I think is an interesting comparison both with Ireland and Spain, that have adopted the recognition of the Palestinian state as a unilateral decision. In Italy, it has been explicitly said that no way it is a viable situation or solution. So no support to a unilateral recognition, but yes, as an auspice for the possible future, when it will be possible, when we understand who, when, how, with which borders and which territory, to a Palestinian state. So the two-state solution as a wished-for solution, but not viable in this moment. That's the position of the Italian government. It has been repeated exactly like this yesterday by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. But what we are trying to restate all the time is that anti-Semitism is not on a political arc, one or another, is not a menu that you are politically choosing which one you address, but it is the phenomenon in its whole situation. So because it's a sum of very, very differentiated situations that put together the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, you cannot explain it if you deal with it only as a fascist or nostalgic fascist groups.
Rabbi Wieder, can you give us a sense of the background for what you see from Dublin, what you see in Ireland, as it might compare to the Spanish and Italian Jewish realities?
As I mentioned the last time I was on the panel, the Irish Jewish community is made up mainly of Ashkenazi Jews who moved into Dublin starting from around the end of the 17th century, when Oliver Cromwell granted Jews readmission into England and Ireland. And the majority of the community, as we have it now, is made up from families that emigrated from Eastern Europe, mainly from Lithuania, in the late 19th and early 20th century. So it's really families that are well established, that have been part of Irish culture for 6, 7, 8 generations. Now we've got, I would say, around 2,500 Irish Jews in Dublin, and a lot of Israelis. We had a big influx of Israelis in recent years, so maybe another 1,000, 1,500 Israelis. It's hard to know exactly. And these are Jews that have been for so many generations an integral part of Irish society and proud of their place within broader Irish society. So grateful to this country, always doing their most to contribute to wider society in all areas of life. And so many of these families are telling me that never before have they themselves or their parents, their grandparents, in living memory, never have they felt such a strong tension between those two identities of their place in Irish society and their place as Jewish people. And never before have they felt their viewpoint as Jewish people to be so delegitimized. I don't want to take anything away from David, but I really do think Ireland could give Spain a run for their money on his title of the most anti-Zionist, anti-Israel country in the West. And it comes out at so many levels of society, in the government, in opposition parties, in universities, in schools, across Irish media. A point that I think it's very important to stress: it's not about criticizing Israel. It's very understandable seeing the war going on and seeing the pictures that we're seeing the whole time coming out of Gaza, that people will have strong views and people will ask questions about the extent of the destruction in Gaza, and people will criticize Israel and ask questions about what's going on. But what's going on here is way beyond that. It's a complete denial of the context of this war. It's a refusal to give any platforming to Israel's side of the story. It's portraying the current war in Gaza as, for the most part, Israel being a genocidal regime intent on killing as many innocent Palestinians as possible. So one thing that I've been trying to stress, and other leaders of the Jewish community, is that while the government and politicians will talk a lot about the fact how they're anti-Israel and not necessarily anti-Jewish, and they'll stress a lot that anti-Zionism obviously is an anti-Semitism, that might be true in the way they're perceiving it, but the way the war is being spoken about and the lack of context that's being given and the bias in politics and in the media often translates itself across Irish society to anti-Semitism. So we've seen a noticeable rise in anti-Semitism online and in university campuses Thankfully, nothing physical, no violence. And we're very grateful for that. We're very grateful to our police and to our local authorities for keeping us safe. But the rhetoric that's being adopted is very one-sided, and that has contributed to a feeling of intense disquiet amongst the Jews of this community. And I've had people in their 60s and 70s telling me that for the first time they're really considering their future in this country, or telling me that at the very least they don't want their kids or their grandkids to be brought up in Dublin or in Ireland if what they're going to be exposed to the whole time from the media, or what they're going to be exposed to in schools and in universities is a type of one-sided narrative that we're seeing nowadays. So it's really been a very trying 8 months for the Jewish community here. It's affected day-to-day living for a lot of members of my community. Again, it's important not to take it out of proportion. We haven't experienced physical violence, physical anti-Semitism, but it's certainly a feeling of disquiet and discomfort.
Yoni used the word disquiet within the Jewish community. Has that spawned or catalyzed, for example, not only discussion, but a willingness and an actual execution of people picking themselves up and moving to Israel? Can you take us from disquiet to how it's manifested?
The level of disquiet is evident. We're all under trauma after October 7th. And there's another trauma, which is the trauma of October 8th, which is to see how the whole West has risen in terms of crazy anti-Semitism that we wouldn't expect. We were expecting a bit of sympathy at the very least in the middle of this trauma, and that didn't happen because there was obviously a concoction from the ultra-left and unfortunately too many Muslims throughout the West that started to rise against not only Israel, but Jews at large. And waking up to that reality, of course, is discomforting and it is worrying. And it has brought to us a sense that we were living in some kind of a chimera. I was listening a few moments ago, a testimony of somebody who considered herself a radical leftist and who lived next to Gaza in one of the kibbutzim. And she said, I no longer believe in peace. So same thing with many European Jews and Western Jews who understand that things are not as simple as we used to think. That hasn't translated yet into a reality of massive aliyah, because at the end of the day, people are also worried about what is happening in Israel. But everyone that you speak to starts to think about a plan B. And I think that before we go into plan B, we should stay in plan A. And plan A means we need to make sure that as Westerners, as citizens of our countries, and as Zionists, we also explain very clearly the situation that is taking place in Israel. And we draw a parallelism with the situation that we have also in our host countries, where we're loyal citizens, that we respect our constitutional systems, and where we're here to fight. I love it when I hear what Noemi explained about what is happening in Italy. We look at you with tremendous admiration, and we hope that there will be soon enough the situation in Spain when the center and the center right or the right will be able to come to power and to be very open about the reality that we live. We live in a very complex environment with different political puzzles that are at play. But the moral complexity of the situation is very simple. There's good guys and bad guys. And unfortunately, this is as simple as a conflict as it gets. And we make sure to explain it to people that live around us. And we are also explaining that Israel is a little bit forefront of what's going to happen in Europe. International terrorism and Palestinian terrorism has been always at the forefront of that. They're early adopters and inventors of many of these attacks, of suicide bombings, of kidnapping of airplanes, of car rammings. And there's been a lot of people that have been looking at what happened on October 7th, and it was successful. So we should worry in Europe and in the West about attacks of youngsters, of a couple hundred youngsters having weapons and going crazy into the cities of the countries where we live. And believe me, European countries are not ready or as ready as Israel was. And Israel had a moment of weakness and of being fooled by a whole set of things. But if something like this were to happen in Europe in such numbers, many things could change. I'm not a betting man, but my sense is that things are going to take place in Europe in the months to come that are going to change very much the perception of many of these ignorant and naive voters that want to take the nightmare away from here and think that it's a Jewish issue and let the Jews deal with that. They don't understand that this is a global phenomenon that is here with us and to stay.
What do you foresee as unfolding in Spain over the next 3 to 5 months? Will it have to do with the parliament? Will it have to do with the political system? Will it have to do with how the general public reacts to the Jewish community?
I don't have a crystal ball, but I can tell you that my experience in the world of business and in the world of politics tells me that you always have known unknowns and unknown unknowns, like Donald Rumsfeld used to say, and rightly so. Here we know the known unknowns. We have elections in the US. This is very important for the future of the Middle East. We have a Democratic convention taking place in August in Chicago. That's going to be also very interesting. Those things affect us. There's no doubt about that. There were Euro parliamentary elections recently, June 9th. These are currents that were not very clear, but that are slowly getting there. What we don't know is how the copycat effect of what happened on October 7th is going to be developed in other places. Now, you can be sure that that's going to happen. These things tend to be copied. Now, the only reason why it's not being done is because it doesn't make too much sense to go massive and to do attacks like this, because many governments, including the Spanish one, are basically doing what the terrorists want, which is basically for the radical left to stay in power and to put pressure into Israel. So supposedly Spain, Norway, Slovenia, and Ireland are probably the countries where it would make less sense for Islamic jihadism to go further against us. It would make more sense, sorry, Noemi, for countries like Italy and countries that have been more forceful and more defensive of Israel. But you never know how things can happen, because this type of logic doesn't necessarily apply. At times, what would make more sense is to let us all sleep and not to wake us up from this, and to beat us and to have it done through the belly of Muslim women, as Gaddafi used to say, which is a crazy sort of analogy, but it's a reality also of demography that is changing in this part of the world. But although predictions are never easy to put forward, I can tell you that the problem is served. By the way, it's not only in Europe, it's also in the United States. The only thing that I think that Jewish communities have to do, it's a moral responsibility, is to alert that all of this is not the problem of Israel, it's not the problem of Jews. We are, again, the canary in the mine. Once again, I don't know why it happens, well, I kind of know why it happens, but at the end of the day, people should be alert that it's going to happen in many other places, and there has to be a reaction to this.
We're talking about abridgment of freedoms, essentially, or liberty, or the big picture, rather than just the narrow ones. Noemi, what are the manifestations within the various communities? How have they reacted in terms of their sense of community, of going to services more frequently, of hanging together, things that you didn't really see in great measure before October 7, but maybe you saw an increase since?
I wouldn't say that the first reaction is to run away and go to Israel, but not because people feel so secure in Europe. The conclusion, at least until now, is that while 7th of October happened in Israel, and of course I share the thoughts that what is happening there as values and challenges regards Europe, but the feeling is 7th of October happened there, then the hatred as a wave is here in Europe. And if and when it will be solved in Israel, because sooner or later it will be solved, of course, death toll is horrible, but it will be solved. Somehow Israel will restart. But here, the hatred and anti-Semitism is more rooted and more evident, and it will not go away. It will not finish as a war that finishes. So this is an understanding that penetrates in the hearts and minds of people. So it's not the fear of living the war on bombs or missiles, but it's the fear of living with the person that was a friend and is not anymore, of isolation, of suspecting that the society in its general is divided between people who evidently are haters, explicit haters that you hear, you see them shouting around, And it's not the majority of the Italian, we must say. It's the people that you hear, of course, very loud and very strong. We suffer from it, but it's small groups of students, it's small group of a population, it's always the same ones that with the virus, with every opportunity, they are the ones who appear on 70 millions of Italians. So there is a huge part of Italians that are silent, that suffer the Palestinian situation of Gaza because of the war, but they are not in a feeling of accepting the hatred language and the Hamas invitations. So what happens to Jews in Italy is that on one hand, they hear the haters, and we try not to hear them all day. But the real problem is not the haters, because of course you identify them. The real problem is the normal person that doesn't say anything special, that say, well, we suffer for the Palestinians, we would like this and that, let's hope and pray for the end of the war. But the end of the war is not magic, because it will not end the problem. And you are not able in a workplace, in our friends, in dinners, really to speak freely, because you don't trust people anymore. So friendship that are lost, people that try not to go to dinners with other people because you cannot speak about the topic. So we can speak freely among ourselves about the fears, about the suffering, about the shock, but we cannot always discuss about it unless it's really very few people who are really very bright, very lucid, very clear with their minds. And they come to you and tell you, I know the situation is very complicated, and I am sure that Israel is in the right situation, or you Jews are doing the best to address the propaganda and things like that. So the impact on the community is isolation, trying to be among ourselves, not more of the synagogue, but let's say more among the Jewish people. And let's say that somehow people also fear. Some have taken out the mezuzot from the door of the house. They try not to appear with kippah and so on. So you are frightened. There is a level of fear, of physical fear.
Yoni, as a practicing rabbi, what have people said to you? What are their reactions? How have you tried to minister to them in their sense of uncertainty?
The feelings are very mixed, because on the one hand, there's a need that we all have at a time like this to want to try to do something more proactive and change things and affect things and influence things. And the reality is that for most people, the amount that they're going to be able to influence and impact and change is very limited. The difficulty is that at some points, just the frustration gets quite overwhelming, because I would say personally, it's like you see the reaction to October 7th, and okay, the media and the governments did say good things in support of Israel, and then that narrative changed very, very quickly to be what I was describing. And it goes on for months and months like this, and suddenly you feel this just overwhelming sense of frustration. Why do they not see the other picture? Why are they not willing to hear that there's another side to it? It's hard to know if there's a good answer to that. I'll just give one example. The attitude that's reflected by the media or by politicians, I don't think accurately reflects what your average Irish person on the street would be thinking or feeling necessarily. Now, definitely, most people are going to be swayed by what they're consuming in the media. And as I've said many times, if I'd only be seeing the images every day that are being floated in Irish newspapers or on social media, I would also hate Israel. If I didn't see any other side to the story, I would also feel that very overwhelmingly. But something that I've often said in interviews, and very rarely been quoted when the interview has actually been broadcast, is that I've had dozens of people coming up to me on the street, not because they know I'm the chief rabbi, but because they see I wear a kippah on my head. And they say to me things like, I want you to know that our politicians don't speak for us. We stand with Israel. We're ashamed. We're disgusted, to use their words, not mine, by our government's actions. I got that a lot, particularly after the recognition of the Palestinian state. And dozens of my congregants have told me that they've had similar stories from their colleagues and acquaintances. And it's baffling because that type of thing doesn't fit in with the way the media is portraying a very generic, one-sided anti-Israel sentiment amongst the Irish population. Or if you look at the Eurovision a couple of months ago, the second highest number of votes that any country received in Ireland after Ireland was Israel. And that to me was a moment where we could turn around and say, look, clearly there's a lot of people in Ireland that have a lot more support to Israel than you'd get the picture from listening to what the politicians say or listening to what's portrayed in the media. And we've had pro-Israel rallies and that have been attended by hundreds of non-Jews. And again, the Irish media doesn't talk about it. So to me, I've just got this overwhelming sense that there are agendas here that politicians or that the media is trying to fill. And for whatever reason, the sense is that if we adopt this very strong pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel stance, that's going to make us popular. That's what people want to hear. And I've almost got to this stage where, yes, we should use our voice where we can, and we should be speaking up to present that other picture or that other side of the story. But I've almost come to the stage where trying to look at it and trying to encourage my congregants to look at it, that this is almost their mindset that they're stuck in. And once we've done all we can to try to change that and realize that that's not going to change, we've got to do the best we can to carry on as a strong community ourselves and to be the best we can be ourselves, accepting the reality as it is. Maybe that's a bit defeatist. Maybe we should be trying a bit more to change, but I think that's the reality. We're so small, we're such a small community, and the extent to which this outlook is entrenched and ensconced in Irish society amongst the politicians and amongst the media is so deep that I don't know if we can do much more than focus inwards on ourselves at a time like this and be as strong as we can be.
There's a common denominator of the three of you in the sense that you're living in societies where the predominant religion of the respective countries is Catholic. What you've also made a distinction clearly is that the media acts as this left of center orientation that has anti-Jewish or anti-Israeli or pro-Palestinian viewpoints, however you want to define it. How have your relationships with the Catholic community been since October 7th? We learn in the United States that some progressives ran the other way, and ministers who were friends didn't speak up, and then others came immediately and they put the hand around a rabbi's shoulder and say, I feel deeply for you.
Our relationship with the Catholic Church over the last decades has improved tremendously. Jews and Catholics in Spain meet regularly at the highest levels of our institutions, and we do share a lot. This has not been a part of the responses or the ecosystem after October 7th. The Catholic Church hasn't taken any stand whatsoever. There's many people that have been supportive of Israel that happen to be Catholic, and they're faithful Catholics, and they would tend to vote to the right or to the center right. So clearly, from that perspective, there is an alignment. But no, there hasn't been an official position by the Catholic Church. We do have also an evangelist community. They are supporters of Israel, very staunch ones here in Spain, as I'm sure that it happens in other places in Europe, and of course in America. And they have taken a stand very, very clearly. They have come to our demonstrations. But unfortunately, the situation of the Catholic Church in Spain has its own dynamics. It's losing a lot of ground. Luckily for the Catholic Church in Spain, we have Latin Americans that have come in various migrations, and they're the ones who fill up the churches, not really the local population. There are many Catholic schools in the country, so there are youth that are part of the Catholic faith, but there's no assertiveness that you may see, and obviously this is an issue that doesn't bring votes and brings at least some level of polemics, and they walk away from it. So not good.
Of course, we are at the very, very center of the relationship, both with the Vatican and the Italian Conferenza Episcopale, which is the representative of the church in Italy. With the President, Cardinal Zuppi, and the Pope, we have met, and with Parolin, who is the Cardinal who represents all the political diplomacy of the Vatican. I personally met with both, with deep and long conversations. Basically, the church since October 7th has always, and probably twice a week, because it's Sunday and Wednesday when they have the general audience, repeat exactly the same concept, that we must engage for peace and for both and have two states. And somehow it's understandable from the church point of view, which is, of course, they want everybody to live in peace and no war, which is not easy. And this is about the war. What we asked from the church more strongly is to give strong statements on the anti-Semitism here in Europe, in Italy, in our cities, because the challenge of coexistence and living is the challenge of anti-Semitism. So it's not enough to say we pray for the peace in the Holy Land, but to say we don't want to see here distortion, hatred, anti-Semitism, call for hatred in all kinds of situations, like we saw in Milan on the main cathedral, the Palestinian flag. So this, of course, was taken after a few minutes, but it doesn't match to the sentiment. But it's a challenge, I think, compared to the level of the dialogue that we had with the church until October 7th, and was a very important religious dialogue. I think we have some steps back in this level of dialogue. We need to restate some aspects of why we make religious dialogue, and we want the church to be explicit in condemning some situations. At the same level is the issue of how we develop on the European developments that we had with the recent elections and expectation on the UN. So maybe I want to add some words about it.
I think it's an important question about the relationship with the church, and somebody on the Q&A here asked about relationships in general with clergy from other Abrahamic religions. And this has been a really interesting point, because for me, October 7th and post-October 7th has been very eye-opening, because we had, myself and my predecessor before I took up the role, positive relationships with many faith leaders in Ireland before October 7th. And the truth be told, I was very disappointed with the reaction, not only of the Catholic Church, but I would say in general, faith leaders. Very, very few messages of support in the immediate aftermath to October 7th. And then some of the things some faith leaders have been coming out and saying since then have been quite shocking. There have definitely been exceptions, but it's been quite shocking. And it really made me reflect on the type of interfaith work we've been doing pre-October 7th. What I came to realize really is that because we obviously come from such different religions, we tend to focus on that which we have in common, and we tend to focus on that which unites us. And interfaith up until now has been quite superficial, I would say. It's been very generic and speaking about the fact that all Abrahamic religions cherish peace and cherish love and justice and universal humanity, all these type of ideas that are lovely to talk about, and when the going is going well, maybe fosters more tolerance and respect. But it's avoided speaking about the elephant in the room, and now it's been very clear that the elephant in the room has been Israel. And it really struck me that leaders of other faiths do not appreciate the affinity that the vast majority of the Jewish community has with Israel, with the state of Israel. They don't recognize that Israel is the geopolitical center of Jewish peoplehood, that it's the heart of our religion, that for 2,000 years of Jewish liturgy, we've been speaking about returning to Israel. They don't realize that so many Irish Jews will have friends and family in Israel, that there's a deep sense of Jewish peoplehood, that we're part of one entity, that when rockets are fired into Tel Aviv or when hostages are taken from Israel, that Jews in Ireland will intensely feel that pain. And it really made me realize that as a rabbi and as leaders of the community, it's our responsibility going forward to try to bring that up a little bit more and try to speak about Israel, not just in the context of the war, but in general going forward, not to avoid speaking about it because it's the elephant in the room, because you can't expect them to understand our point of view, the Jewish point of view, if we don't do that job of talking about it and explaining it.
That's a very, very, very good point. The centrality of Israel in diaspora Jewish identity, and the reason that diaspora Jews feel so intimate to the state of Israel. When Israel gets stung, world Jewry feels like they've also been hit. And the manifestation of anti-Semitism is a perfect example of it. actually showing. But I think your point is so well made that we have to do a better job of making others or helping others understand the forthright connection of Jewish identity to the state of Israel. If that's the only conclusion we walk away from this program, that was a major, major one.
Unity that brings strength. That's what it's all about.